Hey, if you're watching this live, then you really probably just saw me a second ago doing the UFC Vivisection. It's been a busy week. It's always a busy week when we got a Bellator World Series of Fighting and a UFC show all in the same week. Honestly, this World Series of Fighting show, not that bad. Not great, but I'm joined by Vic Rodriguez. I'm really jumping the gun. I'm all over the place here, but Victor, thank you for joining me once again to talk World Series of Fighting, the third largest MMA promotion in the United States, for what that's worth.
Pleasure to be here, and yeah, that's pretty much the state of things as it stands. It's not a bad place to be considering the marketplace, but yeah, they're chugging along, and we're gonna see some pretty decent action on this card, which we're gonna get to.
Yeah, it's like I say, it's kind of a weird week because Bellator has the best card this week. The UFC is kind of putting on a get fighters rounds card, fulfill some contract obligations card over in Poland, and the World Series of Fighting card. There's actually like there are a few names I'm interested in. That I think this is a card that's more like it's not freak fights, but it's more like interest than actuality. Like there are guys where I'm like, ooh, I want to see him fight, not because I think he's really like an awesome fighter, but I just want to see him fight. Like it has that feel of some of those like Moosin or some of those
Mm.
cards, like the big one-off like U.S. cards where they put like a bunch of random guys where you're like, oh, I kind of want to see that. Like this kind of has that feel to it.
Yeah, the strange thing is that there isn't as much, uh, there aren't as many matchups that seem to have consequences for the divisions of the respective fighters. But uh, that being said, there are still some fun things that are worth watching. And yeah, as you mentioned, it's more of like, oh, that guy, oh, that guy. You know, guys that have kicked around a bit on the regional scene have put on some pretty fun performances, and you're interested in seeing how they perform at this point, or what's going to happen from here on in based on how they perform this week.
And given that the undercard is pretty bereft of talent, there's maybe one, two fights we might talk about a little, but there's not a lot going on there. We're really going to be focused on the main card here. It's just not worth researching and spending time getting into a World Series of Fighting undercard at this point in their promotion.
Yeah, this is perhaps one of their more local focused cards in terms of how the undercard is set up. A lot of guys that are from the region or trained trained at schools and academies that are maybe affiliates of people that are popular in the region as well. So, a lot of New England fighters, a lot of maybe North Jersey, some New York guys thereabouts, and some interesting names, but not perhaps the more popular fighters or people that most MMA fans have heard of. Still, there's some promise, and it seems that it's been set up to deliver a fair amount of action. So, yeah, we're going to get into that now.
Yeah. Well, before we do, let's talk a little bit about just what's latest updates on World Series of Fighting, like we always do, because
Mm.
it's one of those promotions that generates just enough news to have a few stories out there, but not something that necessarily everybody keeps up on because it's not the UFC. Um, and that's really what 90% of the MMA fan, even as hardcore fans, tend to focus on. The big things, and they actually do revolve around this card, are the loss of two fighters, Melvin Guillard and Vinny Magalesh, and they're kind of I called it before we started the sister problems in for World Series of Fighting in that they're both sort of prima donna talents that are really tough to work with and that tend to put themselves in really difficult situations with the promotion that they work with.
I would have to agree with that to a point. I would certainly say that in the case of someone like Melvin Gillard, more because there's so many different points that are set on. When, for example, you look at someone who's had problems with his conduct, uh, difficult to negotiate with financially. doesn't want to do PR, things of that sort. Whereas Vinny, he knows he's good, he knows he's talented. I don't think that there's a point in which he perhaps hasn't realized that his value as a commodity in the jiu-jitsu community may not translate as to his success or might where it should be in the MMA community. So it gets a little weird. I mean, just because you carry that name over from grappling, and just because you do show a lot of talent in spurts doesn't necessarily mean that you're a megastar all of a sudden and that you should be paid and treated and I'm always for the rights of fighters. I think all fighters should be getting paid more across the board, but you know that's not necessarily the reality of the sport. If you're going to get offered a certain amount and you're not happy with it, I don't know. There's probably better ways to go about it. Is pretty much what I'm
Well,
trying to get at.
they're both guys that I mean, and Giard, to his credit, didn't have this reputation until after he got cut from the UFC. Really, I mean, in the UFC, he was just a guy. He was a promising talent for a long time, but he wasn't somebody who seemed like he was really causing a lot of internal turmoil.
Yeah.
But now they're both guys who are kind of trying to walk out on contracts. And Magalesh has had this, this is a label that he's had for a while, ever since he walked out of M1 Global, um,
Hmm.
and tried to auction their belt off, I believe, was when as he
He
left.
he
Um,
actually did. He
yeah,
actually managed to auction it off. Yes.
he auctioned the belt. So Vinny, like he's classically, and he tried to walk out of Titan FC to be with World Series of Fighting and participate in this tournament, and just was like, well, you're under contract with us. You can't just walk out of your contract to go to another promotion. That's not how it works. And Giard now appears to be trying to walk out of his World Series of Fighting contract. He said he was like, oh, I'm going to show World Series of Fighting. I hate them. I don't want to fight for them, but I'll go out on a high note, and everybody else that's bidding for my services, they'll get, the real great hot talent that is Melvin Giard, and then suddenly he's not submitting medicals, he's not showing up for events,
Mm.
and he's getting pulled
Yeah.
off the card.
Yeah, the thing with Gallard, though, what makes it so strange is he had a deadline, according to what Ray Sefo had said yesterday, he had a deadline of handing in his medicals last week, last Friday. Then apparently no news from him over the weekend, no news from, I guess they're hearing from his management, but not from him. There's a whole back and forth going on. They gave him a deadline of Monday, sometime around noon, still no medicals. No one's heard from him at ATT. There's rumors that he hasn't been training, not either there or anywhere else. And I believe it was on the Submission Radio interview that he did last week where he buried World Series of Fighting.
Mm-hmm.
He mentioned something about working as a doorman at either a strip club or a dance club or something to make ends meet, which is strange for a guy who was bragging about how much he was getting offered after he left the UFC. He was talking about how he was getting offers for more than what he was getting at that time in the UFC. Well, look, if you're getting paid, what is it, whatever his paycheck is, 40 or 50 or 60 to show and then to win, um, you kind of have to deliver if a regional promotion is going to shell out that kind of money. It ain't just former UFC talent. Like there's a swath of things that follow with that. Like you have to play ball with them. You have to at least show up and be responsible and make weight, which he hasn't done yet. So, it's more his problems are much more noticeable, I guess, than Vinny's.
Yeah, they're both just it ended up casting. I mean, and not really casting a pall over this card because, like I say, World Series of Fighting isn't necessarily a promotion that people are like, oh man, World Series of Fighting 20 is coming out. Can't wait to see Melvin Giard fight. Like, you know, that wasn't, I think, really like on most people's mind, but it's definitely, in terms of what's new with World Series of Fighting, mostly it's contract problems. And for once, it's not World Series of Fighting creating the contract problems. I gotta say, like, this does not
Yeah.
appear to be a
Yeah.
mess of their making.
No, like we said last time that we talked about this, they've really seemed to turn things around, as evidenced by the structure of their cards, as evidenced by what their fighters are saying or not saying. And at this point, it's not even something that they can just sit back and go, well, hey, listen, this isn't something that we caused. If Melvin, when you got a reputation like that, because Vinny at least had the benefit of M1, like, there was there was the idea that M1 was probably holding him back. You know, they were being strict with their contracts, maybe some promises that weren't being kept, and so people were firmly in Vinny's corner. You know, I almost bid on that belt when the auction came up, and I was disappointed to see that it only went for $15, but or something like that. But yeah, I mean, this whole deal with Melvin. And he wants to get back into the UFC's good graces. This is probably not the best signal you want to send. So yeah, these two fighters, as much as I like them, as excited as I am to see them fight when they go out or whenever they have a fight announced, I don't know, man. It really is a big disappointment.
Yeah, it's weird, and I do, I'm not saying that like World Series of Fighting doesn't, they may not be. It's not, Giard did talk about like promises not kept and stuff like that. So like World Series of Fighting isn't necessarily, I don't put them like no blame ascribed at all on their side, but
Yeah.
you gotta show up and like do the paperwork and like go through all those turns. If you want to blast them in the media while doing that, go for it. As far as I'm concerned, like that to me is fine. Like, but it seems like one of those situations where he's. I almost I feel for him because fighting's a hard life. It's a hard career, and it seems a little like he's just kind of going off the rails.
Yeah, it really is, and it's a shame because I remember when he went on that streak in the UFC. You know, I would see Melvin. I'm thinking, man, that guy could be fighting for a lightweight title a year from now, and everything seemed to just go off the rails. He left Jackson's, everything very well. You know, we already know. You know, leaving Jackson's, going to
Yeah.
Black Zillions, leaving there, then Grudge, now ATT. You know, you want better for fighters like this, you know, and it really is a shame because not only is he talented, he seems like a generally great guy.
Yeah, it's tough. So let's take a look at this card now. Now that we've stuffed a little downer into the beginning of the show, um, I think there are a few fighters here and there. I'm familiar with most of the main card, but the only name that pops up for me on the undercard, and it's one of these things that I think World Series of Fighting is sort of secretly doing. They're sort of like almost the new Bellator in this way, whereas Bellator was taking a lot of the mainland Russian fighters, or Central Russian fighters, I should say, not mainland, because it's not. I mean, it's not
Yeah,
like Russia has these islands. It's not, it's not like mainland U.S. and Hawaii, mainland Russia.
yeah,
No, I mean,
yeah,
Bellator got in on the Central Russian fighters. They got the Shlemenko, Sarnovsky, Volkov, a lot of the big, the guys from that scene before anybody else did. And the UFC sort of started to pick up guys here and there. They're being really choosy, looking for guys with really hot records, guys that have a lot of experience. But now it seems like Bellator's starting to tap in and get those Dagestani and those Caucasus fighters and bring them over. They recently got Abubakar Nurmagomedov. I believe we saw Timur Valiev on the last card.
we
And
did,
now we're
we did.
seeing Islam Mamedov on the undercard here. And, they're finding these hot Dagestan products and bringing them over to the U.S., which, I mean, this might be the gateway for Dagestani fighters to get to the UFC, would be through World Series of Fighting cards to get the experience, getting their visa in order, and getting with an organization that will maybe let them go when they've had a few fights.
Yeah, and it also, I mean, I'm imagining that they're allowing a certain degree of flexibility. We saw, as you mentioned, Valiev in the last card. I mean, I kind of imagine he would have won against Ed West. I didn't think he'd do that well. There's always something about these fighters from that region that you just, sometimes when they experience a degree of growth, it's sometimes much more than you expected, probably more so than any fighter from any other nationality outside of Demetrius Johnson. It's just leaps and bounds sometimes with some of these guys. Um, Mamedov, man, if you should be, everyone should be excited for this one here. This is worth logging on early and checking out the prelims just to see this one fight, especially for Mamedov. I mean, the guy's 10-1 as a professional. He's got 7 submissions under his record. He trains with Frodo Hasbullaev of Bellator fame and also with Sultan Aliyev, and appears to be friends with Khabib Nurmagomedov, interestingly enough, who cornered him in his last fight. excellent passing on the ground, great timing, hunts for submissions. I mean, this guy is he's very multifaceted in terms of the complete MMA game. He's not just a guy who's going to get to the ground and only grapple. No, he's looking for opportunities, and he's got this whole thing figured out. So this is definitely going to be a hell of a lot of fun.
Yeah, he's a serious talent to be watching out for. Is there anyone else on the undercard that caught your eye? I mean, I've seen Saul Almeida in Bellator, but that's not exactly like a, oh my God, you have to watch Saul Almeida. You know, he
Yeah,
was not great in Bellator. Um,
Almeida. Yeah. Well, I mean, Almeida's a very talented guy, and I mean, he's going on in what would be a stylistically, it looks like to be an exciting matchup. I don't recommend it as highly as the Mamedov fight, mostly because of his opponent Leon Davis, who also should be noted. Also, very talented guy, big wrestling takedowns, hunting for submissions. I still favor Mamedov, but those two are probably the most notable guys that I'd say that we should look out for on the undercard. So that's going to be
yeah,
good.
the rest of this is a lot of guys from like CES and
Yes.
CFFC and Ring of Combat, like a lot of guys off that East Coast scene. Like it seems like every time that World Series of Fighting goes to any specific part of the country, they look for a bunch of regional guys that they can pull for a quick undercard filler. You know, we may not see any of these guys in World Series of Fighting again,
Mm-hmm.
but we're seeing them here. And the East Coast, like that fighting scene, it doesn't produce a lot of great records, but it does produce a lot of tough dudes. So I wouldn't be
Yeah.
surprised to see maybe, you know, a lot of these fights being at a pretty high level, even if they're not guys that you think you should, you know, that look good on paper. You see a lot of guys coming out of there who, like, it just seems like a region where everybody fights everybody, and so you
Mm.
get a lot of like, you know, 9-7, but everybody that guy's fought has been in Bellator or in the UFC or, you know, a lot of tough guys on that side of the country.
Yeah, no, very much agreed. Yeah, there's just a different level of toughness in the Northeast. I don't know if it's the weather or what, but that's something.
So let's get to the main card then. And all the fights on the main card, I'm at least interested in. Like, there's not one fight on this main card, even without Giard versus Dugalupgov, which would have been a great fight. I actually would have loved to see Giard in that fight because I think Dugalupgov has some real talent to show.
Yeah.
But even without that fight, um, it's a great main card. Everybody, I recognize everybody. Everybody's somebody I'm interested in. You know, it may not be, like I say, the fights themselves may not be awesome. There's a lot of inexperience. There's a lot of raw records, a lot of raw fighters, but they're all fighters you should be kind of watching out for. First up, Dugalubgov versus Giard's replacement, Lucas Montoya. What can you tell me about Montoya?
Well, Montoya, we saw him previously in World Series of Fighting. He's trading out of the Southern Utah scene. 8-3 as it stands, has a professional, 5 submissions and 2 finishes by strikes. He had actually beaten Jimmy Spacuzza before in World Series of Fighting, and I really actually am more excited for this now than I was for the Gillard fight, as strange as it may sound. And I'm always excited to watch Melvin fight, as I said before. But the thing with this is that it seems like it's slightly more evenly matched, I'd say, because of the age, because of the fact that these are two guys that are coming up as well. Montoya presents a certain degree of threat on the ground. I mean, he's really slick with a lot of his movement and everything when it comes to his jiu-jitsu, when it comes to finding different positions to get his opponent in trouble. What I don't like, though, is that he has a propensity of getting into dogfights standing. You know, he'll just get in there and start swinging, and he'll take a hit or two, but you know it's going to get him into trouble. It's gotten him in trouble in the past and has gotten him, finished on a few of these, in a few of his fights on the regional scene. So I would be, Ozzy Dugaluvgov, very talented as you mentioned. You know, he's a Team Henzo guy. He's 3-1 right now in World Series of Fighting. He might have a little more than what he bargained for with Montoya, and big ups to Montoya for stepping up like this on a week's notice to fight him, because this is no easy task. But it's going to be probably a little more evenly matched than most people might think at first glance.
That's good. Yeah, Dugalupgov's one of those guys that, and I don't know, I can't remember what what country he originally comes from or what his heritage is. I think he's from the Caucasus as well, but
Yeah.
he's American. Like he trains out of the U.S. He lives in the U.S. He immigrated. It's not like one of those Dagestani prospects, but he has that same sort of thing. Like he's an incredible athlete, and he's one of those guys that could either flip the switch at some point and become a really awesome, fantastic, top tier talent fighter, or will always be this sort of chancy brawler who can win based on his athletic talent alone, or will lose against more technical fighters who can outwork him and press him. So, he's a guy I'm really looking out for just because it could be, at any point he could suddenly just like everything starts clicking and he'll win a bunch of fights and we'll see him at a higher level fighting a lot better competition. Um, so the next fight, Ben Fodor versus Manny Wallow. Manny trains out of Henzo Gracie, Philly, and Ben Fodor, he's the superhero training
Yes.
out of
Yes.
Shoreline MMA in Seattle. Although has he moved? Like I don't think that's right anymore. Is
A lot of a lot of the databases that we use, sometimes, these guys will probably move around, and we don't really see the gym affiliation or team affiliation change for years. So
yeah.
I'm not entirely certain if that's where he still trains or not.
Anyway, break it down
But
for me. What do you
still, yeah. Oh man, and this is another thing. Again, I don't, I know this is gonna sound like this is dump on Melvin Day, but I'm more excited to see Phoenix Jones on this card than I was for Melvin Gillard. Like this is, and that's not a detriment to Melvin. That's just to show. I mean, this guy here, especially with the recent ESPN piece, we talked about him last time we did one of these previews for World Series. This guy is exciting. This guy, just based on athleticism and his relentless style of getting in the opponent's face, he rushes guys. I mean, he's just he keeps his composure in a way, oddly enough, but he's always on the attack, and it's really it's a very fan favorite style. You're not going to be bored by this at all. Manny Wallow has a very solid boxing base. He mixes in some kicks, and he's got some pretty solid Muay Thai there as well. But he's mostly a guy who's boxing centric. He uses a lot of his top position on the ground and everything like that. But he does sort of, I mean, he is coming off a loss to former Ultimate Fighting veteran Chuck O'Neal. He does get into some wild firefights as well, much like Montoya. So I'm not sure how well that's going to serve him against a guy like Fodor who hits really, really hard. This is going to be pretty unpredictable, and it's going to be a hell of a lot of fun too. I mean, what a way to open this card with these two bouts, man. That's pretty dope.
Yeah, they're fun fights. Like I say, this card it's full of guys that I'm interested in. They're fighters that I want to see how they do. I really I don't know what to expect out of them, but I want to see it. Which brings us straight to the next fight: Giuliano Coutinho versus Steve Mocco. Mako obviously was a big heavyweight prospect out of American Top Team. Um, great collegiate wrestler, just monster collegiate wrestler. Lost last time out a decision to Smilinho Rama up in World Series of Fighting Canada and hasn't fought since. That was back in early last year, early 2014. So he's been out for a year after that loss, and hopefully that's a year he's spent really honing his skills. Like he's still really early in his career. We're early days for Steve Mocco if he's if he's dedicated to fighting, even at 33. I mean, heavyweight's a weird place. But
Yeah.
do you know anything about Giuliano Coutinho, his opponent here, and what you expect?
Well, Coutinho, I haven't been able to scout too much video on him, but what I have seen as a professional, he's got two submissions on his record, three TKOs. The guy seems to hit pretty hard, or at least time his shots pretty well. Mako's mostly struggled with his stand-up, and I don't remember if the Rama fight was that for the title, or was that the
Yeah,
fight that Rama had afterwards?
let me check here. That was No, that was not the title fight. That
Okay,
was
so that was
two
probably the
fights
one
later
before
for
the title.
Rama. Rama
Oh,
he
okay.
beat Tim Hague and then he fought Derek Memon for
Uh,
the title.
Yeah. Okay, now I do remember because I remember the Tim Hague fight specifically. Yeah, no, Mako, listen, if your only loss is to a guy who is a champion in a promotion like World Series and who is noted for being very tough and having a lot of upside, you're doing okay. I mean, it's really the most notable opponent he's faced outside of Lou Polly, who's fought for Bellator and a couple of other promotions. So, Mako is being brought along somewhat slowly, and maybe we haven't seen much activity since that fight. I hope he's got enough training partners at ATT and enough instruction to help him sort of become much more complete outside of his wrestling game, because obviously his opponents are going to be expecting that. I don't know if Coutinho is going to be able to deal with his wrestling and his pressure. But then again, it also depends on how Mako's cardio holds up, because that seems to be a problem as well. Coutinho's only losses to former M1 veteran Pat Bennett, and I mean, he hasn't fought guys that are very, very notable opposition, but he's certainly a guy who's also working on his record and kind of coming up in the ranks. He's still growing as well. So this is going to be interesting, mostly stylistically, to see where these guys are and what heavyweight has to offer outside of the UFC. Hopefully, not the bad part of heavyweight.
Yeah, it could be an ugly fight. Like that's the thing with some of these fights, a lot of these guys are super raw. These could all be ugly fights. We could be seeing grinding, just like hold you down, little bit of ground and pound, 3 rounds for all of these. But I'm really personally interested to see like what does Fodor bring, what does Mako bring, what does Dugalubgov bring, what are these guys, what improvements have they made, what can they show us? Because I mean Mako, he's not young, but like I say, heavyweight that doesn't really matter. He's only been fighting for a couple of years, and ATT is a great camp, so it's very unlikely that he's not going to have changed at all, unless he's just never going to. Um, and then, so, to follow that up, we have Nick Newell, Joe Condon. And Newell's, he's another guy. Like, I'm excited to watch Nick Newell fight. And
Yes.
this is, I think, this is a good fight for him. Joe Condon's a guy. He's got to win now in World Series of Fighting. He's been kicking around forever. He's a classic King of the Cage champ. One of those guys who, or King of the Cage product. One of those guys who, fights is really scrappy everywhere, but maybe just doesn't have the physical tools to be a top fighter. Um, and I think like that's the right kind of fight to give Newell right now. Like when we saw him take on somebody who's really like a top prospect in Justin Gaethje, it was not pretty at all.
No,
And
no, it was not.
so
And
I'd much rather see him against like scrappy journeymen who have a lot of experience under their belts.
yeah, this actually seems to me like, Ali Abdelaziz was correct. There was a dispute a while ago in terms of, Newell wanted to fight bigger guys, bigger names. Maybe after that Gaethje fight, we need to take a step back, reconsider, and have him face different levels of opposition and sort of, have him expand a little on his skill set. I don't think it's necessarily just his physical attributes that might be holding him back. I don't think it's really that. I just think maybe it's a little more of I think it's a little more experience. He's got some quick finishes on his record. But when you get dragged into deep waters against a guy like Gaethje, it's a different world, man. It's very different. So I'm always looking forward to Nick Newell fighting, especially this matchup right here, because Joe Condon, I don't think he has not finished a single fight with strikes. Every single fight that he's won by finish has been a submission. 12-7 as a pro. He's been around and back. He's very, very versatile on the ground. He takes a little more damage standing than I'd like, but this is going to be great because Nick Newell on the ground is always fun to watch. And if you're a fan of grappling, this could be very, very exciting. You might see some very technical and very fun scrambles with possibly a finish, or at least a very decent stalemate that won't leave you unhappy. So again, great matchup here on both ends. Great for Newell, very big scalp for Condon if he wins as well. So yeah, this is gonna be
Yeah,
good.
I think this is one of those things where like MMA has built this culture of like every fight should be the toughest fight of your career. You know, like
Yeah,
that's the
yeah,
culture of MMA. It's like, well, if you're gonna fight, you should fight the toughest possible guy, and that will help you improve the most and do the most
mm,
for you. And that's not really how combat sports in general tend to work. Like
no,
there's a lot to be said for gaining confidence and being like, okay, I know, I'm going to be in a bunch of different situations with guys that maybe aren't going to kill me. You don't want to fight total cans, but
mm,
guys who are maybe, they're tough, they're scrappy, they're tough, but they're
mm,
not physically imposing. They're not a big knockout threat, or maybe strikers who aren't great grapplers, people that can give you a chance to show off and use your tools and get more comfortable with them. And I'd like to see a little more of that in MMA in general, not just for Nick Newell. It's just something that I don't mind seeing more of. It's like
mm,
uh, maybe Steve Mako versus Juliana Coutinho. Coutinho's not bad, but maybe, it's not Smilian Rama. It's not
yeah,
giving somebody the absolute toughest fight available every single time out.
yeah.
That's just
And
me.
even if that was a reality, even if that were possible, it wouldn't really be feasible in the long run anyway. And I don't think the fighters themselves would benefit and experience the same kind of growth. So I'm totally with you there on that.
So that brings us to our main card fight, our headline fight rather. Dave Branch versus Hani Marks.
Mm,
This is a tough fight to me because, quite frankly, I mean, Branch, he may not be the most exciting fighter the world has ever created, but he's pretty clearly a very good middleweight outside the UFC. Like, he's fighting well, he's staying controlled, he's on the prototypical development track for an MMA fighter, which is to say that, you know, 6 years into his career, which would be about 2013, everything started to kind of click. And since then, he's looked really solid. He got into the UFC early, washed out after one, or, washed out, yeah, with a 2-2 record off a loss to Husamar Palhares, which,
yeah,
like, 3 years
yeah.
in as a pro, losing to Husamar Palhares is pretty meaningless, and his only other loss since then is to Anthony Johnson.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, he hasn't lost to Scrubs either. I mean, that's the
no.
thing. You look at he's only got three losses on his record, and it's funny too because you look at the records of him and Marks. You know, the winning portions are actually identical. They're both 15-3. They both got four
Hmm.
subs and five TKOs. But Branch, maybe he benefited. He's one of those guys who's really sort of gotten better after being cut from the UFC, and we may see him there again at some point. I
Yeah,
mean,
I
this
mean,
is yeah, he could very well do it. He's really gotten a hell of a lot better. He's become much more complete. And interestingly enough, as middleweight champion, this is actually the first leg of the light heavyweight tournament. So I guess he's going to go for two titles. Which, look, you don't have that many middleweights anyway, right? So why not? You keep him active, you keep him happy, he gets paid. Why the hell not? And against a tough guy like Marks at the top of a card, we should be excited for this. This is actually very, very promising, I
well,
think.
and it's just a four-man tournament, right?
Yes, yes, it is. Yes.
So, I mean, if you're gonna make a run at middleweight, Hani Marks and Teddy Holder are is like that's a great way to make a run at, or a run at light heavyweight rather. That's a great way to make a run at light heavyweight. Like those are guys Dave Branch can beat. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
they
And
are.
whenever Matt Hamill comes back, he might just take on him too. I mean, he might end up with both belts. And this is actually something that could be quite marketable for both him and World Series. I kind of like it, man. It's like a weird freak show thing that can end up working out well if it's marketed correctly and sold the right way.
Yeah. So here's the thing with Marks then. On the other side of this, Marks is a guy I think that, a lot of people expected to be pretty good. He's a big, powerful wrestle grappler out of Brazil. But it really looks like his focus has just fallen off lately. I mean, that was the end of
Yeah.
his UFC run, was this, like, just a couple of brutal losses. One of them very understandable to Yoel Romero. There's no real shame in losing that fight.
No.
But then the
No,
loss,
not at all, man.
no,
Not at all. And you're talking about, interestingly enough, he was, what is he, 3-2 in the UFC is what he was.
yeah.
So he had two straight losses after three really unimpressive wins, but two very, very brutal losses. I guess they figured that his upside was probably not,
Well, and
he probably needed more seasoning.
he missed weight against Thiago Santos, and the
Mm,
report coming out of his own camp, I believe, was that he just didn't take the weight cut seriously. Like he was just
mm,
out eating and just not really paying any attention to it at all. And then
mm,
he got dropped by the first body kick that hit him.
mm,
So after that, he's moved back up in weight, which I think is a fine idea. He was a big, like, strong light heavyweight. I never really saw the reason for him to be a massively hulking middleweight. Um, so I like it better at at light heavyweight. Maybe he has to, maybe his, maybe that not taking the weight cut as seriously is less of a huge problem at light heavyweight. He can have that sort of more laid back style, which maybe gets in his head less. Maybe he fights more confidently that way. I don't think cutting weight is the best idea for everyone.
no.
But I do have the question still. Like I go into this fight and I don't trust Hani Marks to win it. Normally it'd be like, oh, Dave Branch is the smaller fighter moving up, and Hani Marks has looked good at light heavyweight in the past. I trust Marks to blanket him, but I just don't trust that Hani Marks is performing the way he should right now.
I'm going to have to partially disagree with one thing, and it's the fact that I'm not sure that there's going to be as big a size difference between the two because Dave Branch is a pretty big guy who cuts a lot of weight too. The difference being that Marks, I don't know if maybe the reason for him cutting down to middleweight was to maybe stave off being cut from the UFC or having a size advantage with what would be perceived to be him keeping his athleticism and strength and skills, but your deficiencies still come with you. It's like when people talk about Roy Nelson dropping down to like light heavyweight or middleweight. Like, yeah, he's still going to have the same holes in his games and in his overall game. So that's something that happened with Marks. And now that he's back at 205, I don't know. I don't really trust it either. I don't know if his striking defense is going to be where it needs to be. I don't know if he's going to be able to take a hit from Branch the way he probably should. And once it hits the ground, I'm actually much more confident in Branch's submission game and positioning than I am in Marks's top game and transitions because what he's mostly going to do is probably just get on top of him and strike. I mean, that's most of what we've seen. So, yeah, I really don't favor Marks at all, despite all of his attributes. I really don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah, the cut was just like a I want to be bigger. He beat Carlos Vimola in his debut and then moved down to 185,
Yeah.
and he beat Aaron Simpson and Andrew Craig there, but it just was like, well, why? It's like the Carlos Vimola cut. Carlos Vimola cut down to 185 too, and it was like you came in as a heavyweight, and you were a small heavyweight, but he was a fine, he was a normal sized light heavyweight, and then he's like, I'm going to middleweight, and it's just like, what?
Yeah.
Why? Why are you?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why are you going to a deeper division and like draining yourself? And he was just terrible at middleweight. So
Well, maybe middleweight wasn't as deep then as well. I mean, still, I mean, yeah, light
it was
heavyweight
still
was
Anderson
probably not
Silva
that
on
all that
top of
either.
it at that time. So
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, you're totally right there. Yeah, yeah, no, man. I mean, look, Branch has fought and beaten better opposition, or at least I'm sorry, fought and lost to better opposition. Um, and he's beaten some bigger names as well. He's much more versatile with his movement, and I just gonna work out. Monster Slam, Husim Harris, and Anthony Johnson. Like you can't come on now. You compare that to the guys that Marks has lost to and how he's lost. That's
yeah,
just not fair.
I gotta favor Branch pretty decisively here. Let me just check
Yeah.
and see if they're odd because I totally missed. I looked earlier and I didn't see any, but we are on. I don't see them. Let's see. Because otherwise, I think we're about wrapped up, and I would like to know, like, is anybody, um,
Yeah. Yeah, the odds
yeah,
should be out by today, and that's another thing. They went back to Friday now, which it would be nice if they had a more consistent schedule. It's not like they're being bumped by college basketball or
Yeah,
anything
no,
major. But
no odds
it is what it is, I
anywhere
suppose.
for World Series of Fighting. So
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
can't give you that, but I'll
Well,
post them with the
uh,
article for those who want to find it over on Bloody Elbow. Anyway, yeah, I don't think any last thing. I mean, like I say, it's a card where every bout on the main card is a bout that I want to see how people perform in it. Like I'm interested to see what guys bring to it.
yes,
I don't know that it's going to be the most exciting night of fights that you could watch. I mean, I think that the UFC has much more of like an underrated but should be exciting card. Like the fights may not be anybody you know, but they should all be pretty fun. And Bellator just has the most solid like bunch of recognizable fighters. Should be an
yeah,
action-packed card. This is like the can you not get
yeah,
enough MMA in your life in any way, shape, and form? Then you should DVR this and watch it Saturday night
yeah.
to replace the normal Saturday night UFC card, which will be Saturday morning.
Or
Yeah, there
Sunday
you
if you're a
go.
degenerate
Watch
like
it
me.
Sunday. But it should have a lot of interesting stuff to keep track of.
uh, yes. Just want to make one final note here. Renzo Gracie is going to be on the announce team for this one, so that in itself should be worth the price of admission because he's always fun to listen and he's probably a little more insightful sometimes than us rooting on commentary. And yeah, also one last thing, a little personal plug. St. Jude's Children's Hospital. Please visit their website. Drop a little money in their bucket. They do good things for good people. And yeah, do something nice for a change. Don't just go out there and gamble. Give it away. And I'm done. That's all I got.
Okay. On that note, see, I have nothing like that. I'm gonna be like, yeah, plug my Twitter. Go follow me on Twitter. You fuck children. Like set me up for such failure here. So on that note, I'm not plugging my Twitter. I'm not plugging Vic's Twitter. Go donate to charity, save a kitten. Do something good
Yeah.
today, folks. And we'll be back for a lot more coverage of this brutal, violent, horrible, trash sport that's got nothing to do with all the wonderful charity that you could be doing in your life. We're done here.
uh,